Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation, and I hope my voice holds up. I'm not going to go through the whole text. You can explore it. It's not a terribly difficult text. I mean, it's 400 years old. Yeah, it's got some language differences there, but once you get into the rhythm of it, it's not as hard to understand what's going on. It's interesting to find out a little bit about the discovery of the text. A lot of people think that, of course, this is the text that tells us about the first Thanksgiving and all of that sort of stuff. The whole Thanksgiving tradition in the United States owes its inception to this text, but what people frequently do not realize is that the text was not published at all, was not made public at all in any way until the 1850s, and I believe the first edition was published in 1859. That's because the manuscript, handwritten version, which you can see a little snippet up there in the top right, was in the library of the Bishop of London for years and years. How it got there, don't know, but in the 1850s, someone came across it, thought this would be very interesting to publish, and decided to publish it. Now, this goes down as one of those why do things get published when they get published sorts of stories. And if you know anything about American history, of course, in the 1850s, we were dealing with things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Fugitive Slave Act, Dred Scott decision. And by 1859, when the text was published, we were headed to civil war. I mean, it wasn't a certainty, but it was looking more and more like the country was going to split in two. And this is a text that, among other reasons, was published in part to emphasize the common heritage of the country, the common origin of the country. Now, never mind the fact that the vast majority of us aren't Puritans, didn't come from New England. Most of us probably weren't at all from England at all. None of our ancestors, most of our ancestors were not from England. My ancestors were from England, but they didn't come over until 1720, 100 years later. But it was a way of saying, look, the country has a common origin. The country had an idea. It was founded on an idea, okay? And this text helps us show that. Now, ultimately, and of course, it's no coincidence that right after the text is published, that's when the country begins to celebrate Thanksgiving. It had not celebrated Thanksgiving as a national holiday before then. During the Civil War, Thanksgiving was celebrated by both Northern and Southern troops, and it was this book that helped bring that about. Even though when you get to that passage, you're going to say, that's it? That's all they said? Yeah, there really wasn't much spoken of it. I don't think Bradford made that big of a deal out of it. He just kind of made a mention of it, and I don't know that it was some gigantic feast where everybody was like, carving turkeys and things like that. But it's part of the myth and the legend of the country, and it served a valuable sort of cultural unification purpose and still does. Still a great holiday, one of my favorite. It involves eating and giving thanks, so those are two good things. Why he wrote it. Remember the Great Migration. Remember the difference between Puritans and Separatists. Separatists decided they wanted to break from the church entirely. So they come over on the Mayflower, and others come after them. It's just the Mayflower is just the first one. There was another group called the Brownists. They followed some dude named Brown and believed in soul sleeping and some very unusual sorts of things. But it's sort of a small little trickle of people. But when the Great Migration comes, these are not separatists like the Pilgrims were. These are just mainstream Puritans. And remember the difference between them. Puritans want to stay in Anglican Church. Separatists didn't. Other than that, there really weren't any differences between these two groups, the Pilgrims and all this flood of Great Migration Puritans that come afterwards. It's really not a big bunch of differences. So that after that first generation, that first couple of decades, Bradford is writing, about the events of 1620, 1625, 1629, 1630s, etc. By the time he decides to write down the rest of the history of it and put this all in writing in the 1640s, the Pilgrim separatists that came over on the Mayflower to Plymouth Colony were a tiny, tiny outnumbered minority in New England. And the Puritans who followed them were basically swamped them in terms of numbers. And in fact, what he also saw was that his children and grandchildren were going to marry with the Puritans because there just weren't enough separatists to marry, and then there would really be no separatists. You know, they would raise their kids in Puritan churches because two reasons. One, theologically they were identical. And two, you know, it doesn't really matter when you're a few thousand miles away from England whether you're going to officially separate from the church theologically and, you know, structurally or not. You'd already separated from them with a gigantic ocean in between you. So it was pretty much a moot point. So why does he write it? He writes it because he's afraid that the Pilgrims, separatists, are going to be forgotten. And they almost were. They almost were. In fact, had this not been published, they probably would have largely been relegated to... but what he wanted to say was we were here first. We had our own group, our own story. It was important to tell it. And he tells it also. Big second motivation is to show something about human nature and about God. Okay? So he's a religious guy. He's going to bring that into the book. It's going to be all about that. This is what these people ate, breathed, slept, drank, lived. Okay? Religion was everything to them. And so he wants to write out the story of their struggles to show, one, how human nature is very weak, and number two, how God is very gracious. And the third thing is that he basically says we should not have survived. I mean, you know everything about the story of the Pilgrims starving nearly to death and ending up in the wrong place and being attacked and attacking natives and barely getting by and scraping by and all these kinds of things. And what he's basically saying is, it's a miracle we made it. Now, if you don't think it is, he's right about that. It really is a miracle they made it. If you don't think it is, think about this. Don't think in terms of the number of miles. Think in terms of the time it took to get there. You know, when you think about distance, you can think about miles and you can think about time. It took months to get there. Probably the most analogous thing would be if we were to travel today to Mars. I mean, today we can travel that distance in a matter of a few hours, so to us it's not that big of a deal. But to really put it in perspective, what would it be like for us to go to the moon, or even to Mars, something that would take months to get to? That's how far away they were from England. And for them to make it and to survive, when Jamestown was such a failure, right? That commercial venture didn't fail, but this religious venture, which was based not on money, but on a deeply held conviction about their spiritual relationship to God, that succeeded. Okay, there's something to be said for that. So things to look for in the book as you're reading through it. Number one, acts of providence. There's a young man named John Howland. You'll see that when they're coming over. The non-believers, the strangers on board the Mayflower, these are non-separatists, non-pilgrims. They came across with some secular people that were not part of their church. You'll see that they settled in Holland for a while, and they had to leave Holland because they were afraid. They didn't all leave Holland, some stayed, but they were afraid that if they stayed in Holland anymore, they'd be absorbed by that culture, and by the time their grandchildren were born, they would have no memory of the church that they had founded. They would be completely removed from it. Today, you can go to different towns in Holland where they settled, and you can see people basically in the phone book there with the same English last names. They are descendants of these pilgrims that stayed behind. So they went to Holland. Some of them went to New England as a result of getting this. Okay, the Mayflower Compact, not exactly the sort of the pre-Declaration of Independence that you would think it was. When you get to that, look at these acts of providence. Look at the instances of moral failure throughout the book. You'll see a lot of them. People double cross each other. There's a whole lot of stuff that you'll be forgiven if you skim over it about all of the backstabbing politically, the letters back and forth and things of this nature that, he's making a political case to a large extent that we're really not that interested in. But one thing that you want to pay close attention to, the Mayflower Compact. Notice that the Mayflower Compact was really a document designed to coerce people. Remember, they were headed for Virginia. Their original patent, their original permission from the king was to set up a colony in Virginia. They get blown off course to this place called Massachusetts. And some of the people on board who were not pilgrims, the strangers, right, the non-church members, said, you know what, we're going to get off the ship here and we're going to go do what we want to do because we're not bound to obey the leader of this group, except in the Virginia colony, right? Because that's what the original paperwork said. We're not going to be in Virginia. We're going to be in this place called Massachusetts, so we're not going to have to do what you say. Remember, some of these were indentured servants, so they were bound to do what they were told to do by the head of the Pilgrims, right? Bradford and his crew. Well, Bradford says, well, okay, then if that's going to be the case, we just won't let you off the ship unless you sign this document saying that you will legally do what you would have done in Virginia, even though we're not in Virginia. So they had a choice. They could either sign the document or they could stay on the ship until someone sent them back to England. They didn't have much choice. And the way they looked at it is this: you cannot run off from us. I mean, we don't have that many people. If you're the only guy who knows how to fix the air conditioner, you can't leave. If you're the only dentist we have, you can't leave. You have to stay here with us. So look at that section as well. Another thing to look at is look at the treatment and attitude toward the natives. There's a real sense of wanting to romanticize Native Americans. Please don't fall into that situation. Both sides were very distrustful of one another. Native Americans at that time did not have the same kind of Western European English idea of property rights. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but they really didn't see property the way the English did as something you would. I mean, it's an imperfect analogy, but one way to look at it is to say, if I were to walk into the room and offer you $50 for the air rights in the classroom, and you said, okay, whatever, sure, and then I came along and said, oh, by the way, this is my air now. You've got to pay me $2 a minute to breathe it. You would say, what? You can't own air. That would be a very difficult concept for you to get through, and I would say, no, I paid you fair and square, and you would say, well, wait a minute, whoa. If I knew that that's what you were paying for, I would not have sold it to you, pal. I didn't know you were going to charge me. What do you mean I can't use the air now? What am I supposed to hold my breath? Well, yeah, or leave. So it was a very different. Look at the Native American relationships to them. Neither party are saints here. Both of them misunderstand each other. There's a lot of blame to go around. There's a lot of mistrust and a lot of reason for it as well. The hardships on board the ship and on land, those are very famous. The first Thanksgiving celebration and all those kinds of things. Keep your eyes open for that. There'll be portions of the text where you say, gee, this is boring. You have my permission to speed read through that, okay? But don't speed read through everything. Use the head notes and the introductory sections and the and those kinds of things to guide you on it a little bit. But the bottom line, another thing to look out for, which I think is very interesting, they tried, like the early church, what they thought the early church did, to pool all the land and communally farm, and they nearly starved. So at a certain point, they had to throw in the towel and say, look, human beings are just too greedy. We can't do this community farming thing. We got to give people private property to farm their own stuff, or they won't raise anything. Would have been nice if Vladimir Lenin and Karl Marx had read this, and they would have realized that when the Soviet Union collapsed, gosh, that was 70 years worth of really stupid central planning, because people don't grow food at the same rate for each other as they grow it for themselves. But they had to do it or they'd starve. So that was a huge compromise, and he chalks that up to saying, look, this is again, we learn something about the sinful human nature, but God uses our sin, greed, to actually provide for us. So we had to give in and throw in the towel. So what I want you to try to walk away with is sort of a true sense of how this person viewed the world. It's going to be very different from the way you view it or the way I would view it. And that's okay, right? We're not here to make him into a hero, some sort of, beat the drum and say what a great guy he was. In many ways, he was very admirable. In many ways, these people were very admirable. I mean, they had a level of stick-to-itness that I don't know we would have at all. On the other hand, they were absolutely and utterly convinced that they were right and other people were wrong. They did not come here to establish religious freedom. Let's get that out of the way right quick. They came here to establish what they thought their mission was, that they were appointed directly by God to go do. And they, by golly, did it. For better or for worse. In some ways for better, in some ways for worse, depending on who you were.